I think you can go whenever you want, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to give you a green light, just...
They normally do, okay.
Yeah, just go.
Hi everybody, we're going to get started. So if you're not yet seated, if you could take your seats, that would be great. Are we ready to go? We're live, okay. Thanks very much for being here at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning at the tail end of the extraordinary Perugia International Journalism Festival for the launch of a report and to hear some insights from some of the key subjects of that report produced by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where I'm Senior Research Fellow, and my name is Julie Posetti. And sitting to my left is Maria Ressa, who, as many of you will be already aware, is from her presentations here so far, is CEO and Executive Editor of Rappler in the Philippines. Aron Pilhoffer, who is Professor of Innovation with a chair title that I can't quite recall, but he's Professor of Innovation at Temple University in the US, and a pioneer genuinely in the multimedia space in particular, across mainstream media and digital and startups. And Ritu Kapur, who is the founder of the Indian startup, the Quint. And these two women here represent the case studies at the heart of this report that we are launching today. So the Quint and Rappler and the Daily Maverick in South Africa invited me as a researcher into their newsrooms for a week at a time. So I spent the month of February flying around the world, spending intense time with their newsrooms, with the people in their newsrooms, trying to learn what they did, particularly in reference to reporting and storytelling, that was innovative. And for me, what was particularly interesting is how they responded to external threats and to what we refer to as the unintended consequences of digital transformation, which goes from platform disruption all the way through to the disinformation crisis that we are now seeing. And along the way, along that trajectory is really brutal gendered online harassment, which was also a feature of this study. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to let go of my inner academic and go back to my journalistic broadcast roots and simply talk to you about what I felt, what I saw, what I learned, and what I experienced. And then I'm going to ask both Maria and Ritu to talk about what they, having just read this report, which literally went to press at midnight last night, what they have taken from the report, but also the experience of being involved. And Aron is going to bring it home, because although this project, this part of the Journalism Innovation Project, is focused on countries we refer to as the Global South, which was a deliberate decision, because frequently I have found in my work as a journalist and an academic inspiration coming from the ingenuity of necessity that we see in those countries. And this time I wanted to take that kind of ingenuity and shove it to the West instead of the reverse trajectory which we frequently experience, particularly at these kinds of journalism gatherings of what's the New York Times doing, what's the venerable Washington Post doing, and how do we make the rest of the world aware of that, and how do we replicate that? So this is a slightly different approach. So I went into these newsrooms, again, the Daily Maverick in South Africa, Rappler in the Philippines, and the Quint in India, to study reporting and storytelling innovations. And when I came back from the field in early March with a very tight deadline, but with a desire to be able to pull together a report that developed insights into a way that could be shared at this incredible conference, I realised, in collaboration with colleagues, including Rasmus Nielsen here, who is my boss at the Reuters Institute, a narrow focus on the way in which these three newsrooms are combating disinformation in new and creative ways, because they're at the centre of it's a maelstrom. This is a crisis affecting democracy, affecting journalism, affecting capacity in particular for women journalists to continue to do the work they do in a threatening environment. It's also incredibly given them an opportunity to develop new approaches, not just to reporting and storytelling, but also potentially to sustainable business models. So this is both a distressing and an exciting story, I think. And I came back from these newsrooms, each of which had developed impact journalism, had developed journalism that in the case of Rappler, as you've heard Maria talk about, involved turning the tools of investigative reporting on mapping and the networks of troll armies that began to attack them in the aftermath of their investigative journalism on the Philippines drug war, and the way in which it was being orchestrated with, essentially with connection to the palace, which is the governing space of the Philippines. And in South Africa, with the Daily Maverick, their extraordinary work under the hashtag Gupta Leaks, if you're not familiar with it, examining state capture and the weaponization of disinformation in a digital context through the Bell Pottinger affair. What they were able to do was to build an incredibly loyal audience around really hardcore investigative journalism, telling stories in a way that directly connected through long-form text-based reporting along with digital sort of multimedia and documentary, produced reporting that had a direct impact on the politics of their country, and people have drawn a direct line from that journalism to the downfall of Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa. In the case of India, what I saw up close was a very young, very vibrant newsroom. All of these are commercial newsrooms, I should point out, so this is not a story about philanthropic journalism per se, although there are elements of philanthropic journalism in play. It's not a story about public broadcasting, it's a story about vibrant, young, digital startups which are finding sustainable business models. In the case of Rattler and Daily Maverick, already significantly along the path towards developing those sustainable business models. Ritu, yours is a younger organisation. The Quint started just, you just had your third or fourth birthday? Fourth
2015,
birthday.
We started in
2015. So young, vibrant, millennial-focused newsroom, quite large as an organisation, but pivoting, as one of the interviewees said, pivoting to defend truth. You know, that word that we use all the time in these contexts. We're pivoting to video, we're pivoting to audio. Well, pivoting to truth, led by a mission, which is to defend independent journalism, is what I found at all three. And at the Quint, what they did was very quickly, with Ritu's guidance and leadership and initiation, build something called WebCoof, which she will talk about in detail, but is a very robust fact-checking and verification unit at the heart of the Quint, which we'll hear more about in a moment. And the final thing I want to point out is that this incredible passion, which you can hear in my own voice as I kind of reflect on what it was like to be in these newsrooms, to tell powerful journalism to communities, engaged with communities as a way of defending democracy, disrupted democracy, destabilised democracy, at a time when elections are imminent in all three of these countries. So that is the nature of the research. We call it, in academic parlance, participatory action research. It's kind of like collaborative journalism. It means going into these newsrooms, being embedded with them, watching what they do, but not in a kind of passive way, in an active way, and actively engaging with them. And I did something like 45 interviews with journalists, producers, executive producers, multimedia producers, social media editors, the full spectrum of people you would expect to find trying to tackle these problems. So I'll share some results with you later, but I want to hear what these guys have to say first, and we'll try and keep this as an interactive conversation. And this is seriously fresh off the presses, to be anachronistic. So I've tweeted a link to it. You can sit there and read it as we talk if you like. But if you've got any questions, of course, we're super keen to hear from you too. So Maria, I want to start with you. I know you've had to talk a lot already, and you spend your life these days talking about how, as one of your colleagues said to me, that quote before, you know, our key development at Rappler has been to pivot to defend truth. And that was Stacey DeJesus, who was your social media honcho. So how did you pivot to defend truth, and why?
We were born on social media. I mean, in the end of 2011, if Facebook had better search, we may not ever have built the platform because we found we needed to build a platform. We did. We rolled out Rappler in 2012, January 2012. And Gosh, I don't even know where to begin now. First of all, thank you for listening to me for so much. How did we pivot to truth? So we were born on social media. We knew how fantastic it could be. We were able to create communities of action. That was the mission of Rappler. Because I always felt that journalism was the food we fed our communities. And technology allowed us to actually do things that were never possible before. I was very excited about it. And what we wanted to do was to be able to have real impact. I worked for CNN for almost 20 years, and I hated throwing stories into a black hole, which is essentially what happens when you're reporting outside of headquarters, right? You don't know what happens. Well, I've lived most of my life now in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and Indonesia. And so when we created Rappler, it was with this idea that we could find a way to use technology to jumpstart development. The editorial principles of Rappler, the underpinnings are the Sustainable Development Goals. You'll see it in how we build communities of action. So it was no surprise that at the beginning, we grew 100 to 300%, exponential with Facebook. We were out front teaching our college students, teaching civic engagement through social media. And it was also no surprise that we would be the first to be attacked. That we were like the, what's that phrase? Canary in the coal mine, right? We were the canary in the coal mine because we saw, there was part of me that was very happy when a politician actually used social media as an effective part of their campaign. This is in the 2016 campaigns leading up to the election of President Duterte. And there, during the campaign itself, it wasn't weaponized. It was just using anger and some familiar themes that you can see in all parts of the world, pushing back against the elites, against the oligarchs, but there was just anger. But when it exploded outside, the campaign team would release statements to pull people back. The weaponization of social media happened after July 2016, which is when the drug war began. And so we saw that firsthand. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday, right? I was so naive that I thought our response to it was to, again, pull our communities together and do a hashtag campaign. Hashtag no place for hate. Because I was worried that there were so many people who were already starting to be quiet. Because they were so methodical that as soon as the word Duterte pops up, they come in and flood it. And we know the impact of that, right? All the studies have shown us that if you have trash in your comments, you don't have engagement. Nothing was really done about this. So what we did is we collected data. Because that to me, I wanted to find out what was going on. And you can't find out what's going on. Part of the reason we are so weak in fighting back is because we don't have the data. We got the data. Because I figured, not only were we a partner with Facebook, this is on our properties on Facebook. And then we created a database. We called it the Shark Tank. And the whole idea is, what's an information cascade look like? When it begins here, how does it spread and how does it go viral? And then, like the fact-checking, when you know you have a lie, what are the networks that spread that lie? If we didn't have the Shark Tank, I couldn't have fought back, right? Because all of this stuff, after we came out with our first series in early October 2016, I was bombarded on social media. Rappler was bombarded. Everyone else in our society was watching us getting attacked. And what's the conventional wisdom? You don't respond. Didn't really work. And we all know that doesn't work because a lie told a million times is the truth. All of that erodes confidence in us as individual reporters and in your news organization.
So you turned the "don't feed the trolls" mantra that we heard in newsrooms early on its head and directly responded.
I did, and I got clobbered. And then so talking as the person attacked, you will doubt yourself, and if you don't have the data, you cannot fight back because the attacks are very personal. So for me, data, data, data. We tried to talk to other news groups in the Philippines. Until you feel it, you will not believe it. And I had to wait till everyone else felt it, so that, you know, you've heard me talk about this forever, 2.5 years, I'd say.
And what this report tries to do is to actually almost map what you have done through the case study of developing your investigative journalism approach to telling the stories and doing the reporting connected to exposing the disinformation networks. And you're doing that, it's important to add, I think, in partnership with your really strongly invested audience, your core audience, which has now triggered development of Rappler Plus, which is your membership arm, but also in partnership with the platforms, with Facebook specifically. So, you know, despite, and I think you know, the way in which you have both confronted Facebook in particular, but then also collaborated with them on finding a solution is one of the really important learnings that we could take away.
Let me answer that question that you did, and then take it from why do we continue to work with Facebook.
Yes.
You said Stacy, who's our social media head, said we have to defend the truth. This is a battle for truth. You know, that's, I think globally it is a battle for truth, and the battle is here, the battle is now. The attacks on social media, the cheap armies on social media that erode democracy, they attack truth, which then attacks trust. That goes to the heart of what we do as journalists. This is this whole idea of information's power. The other part of where you took it, Julie, remind me. Then turning it
into storytelling, turning it into a process of collaborating with Facebook, but also audiences.
Facebook.
Yeah.
So I thought a lot about how to solve it, because to me this is not an academic problem. It's existential.
It's human as well.
Yeah, and human. I want to be able to survive. So at that point, we came out with, you know, here's short, medium, and long-term solutions. The long term is easy. It's education. It's why you do reports like this. The medium term is media literacy, and we're doing this. We do workshops. We do a minimum of 2 workshops a month. Sometimes we do 1 every week. We work with other news groups in the Philippines. But in the short term, who truly has the power, right? It's not the journalists. We can do all the stories we want, but if it doesn't get the distribution that the lies get, then it doesn't matter. I've never been in a position like this. I truly enjoyed being with CNN when, you know, if the CNN and New York Times said the same thing, that was all the world thought. Those days are so far gone. It's good and it's horrendous right now. I'm hoping that we get to a better place. But tech needs to come in, and that's the reason why we worked with them. I spent a year, because we're partners with all of the tech platforms, I spent a year internally talking to everyone. When it didn't work, then it was actually Julie who helped me find my voice. We were at UNESCO, I think, some conference, right?
We were in South Africa about 2 years ago. I don't even remember what conference.
And I was slightly ashamed that I was getting attacked, even though I knew we were fighting for the truth. And she just said, "You have to talk."
That's generally my default.
And then she wrote a piece. She forced me to do an interview. When she wrote it, and then it was published, and I was deathly afraid at that point. When it was published, it was liberating. So my advice, talk, shine the light. It is our best defense.
Thank you. You're going to almost bring me to tears sitting on my panel to launch a report. That's, I mean, that might have been a pivotal moment, but what I'm sure you will agree what Maria has done since with her team. You know, I think it's important always to highlight Maria is clearly the face, the human face of this crisis and the way they've fought back. But I met some extraordinary people at Rappler whose voices you'll hear speak to you from this report. A team of very committed, very invested in the mission journalists. And I think for me, one of the other lessons to take away was that if you have leadership and if you have a commitment to the mission of journalism expressed through that leadership in a way that makes the journalists proud enough of the work they're doing to actually stand up to what are genuine threats to their safety in a country where there is a significant history of violence against journalists and the murder of journalists with impunity. And to see the way in which that newsroom is not just kicking goals in terms of being innovative in their storytelling and reporting, but also the way in which those journalists are determined to stick with that mission is incredible. So Ritu, to shift to India and the Quint, which you began, as you said, you've just had your 4th birthday. You began in 2015, and like Rappler, that you were born on Facebook. You literally started, as Rappler did, as a Facebook page. And you invested in this as sort of private equity, you and your husband, who have been media executives in India very successfully for decades. You began this incredibly vibrant, cheeky news organisation called the Quint. You have about 150 odd staff, and you similarly have been in a situation where you've had to take dramatic decisions, quick decisions, but strategic decisions based on what it is that you want to achieve. Can you talk to us about WebCoof and what its role is in the Quint, and just how you have, what you have learned along the way so far in terms of these capacities we're talking about?
Right. Thanks. Like Rappler, we were in 2015, we were born as a Facebook page. That's because you know, I think the word that comes to my mind right now is audacity. We started with audacity. We said we're going to do everything that's not been happening in the country right now. Among that was we'll build our own tech. Now, believe me, in India, when you're trying to build your own WordPress and build your own tech, the audacity comes in the way. And we were ready to launch. We had a full team, and we didn't have a platform ready. So we actually launched on Facebook, not by design, but by default. And it was the best learning experience, because that was the best way to understand for people who came from 2 decades and more in broadcast. It was the best way to understand. What we set out to do, our journey is slightly different from, we've eventually arrived at the similar space as Rappler, but we started off not with the communities of action, building communities of action, but that's where we actually reached. We started off saying that we need to address that the largest percentage of the growing population in India is under 30 years of age. By 2020, 40% of the population is going to be millennials. We need to, let's break the presumption that they are not interested in current affairs and political matters. Let's just dive into that and engage them in their own vocabulary, in their own multimedia style, in their own sort of spunky, irreverent sort of way, and see how they engage with news content if you package it like that. So for instance, our first 2 campaigns, we were born with a campaign which said, say yes to weed. And that sort of got our target audience going. And then our next campaign was, I remember there was a huge amount of moral policing on the young at that time by the Hindutva, cultural values imposing government that had come in. And simultaneously, Modi had a campaign running saying, Make in India. So we actually ran, the second campaign that we ran was Make Out in India. And these campaigns sort of set us up as a distinct voice. But to her point that, had we not been born as a Facebook page, the Quint as a brand wouldn't have found an audience as quickly as we did. But over time, we realized that you don't need to just be cheeky, that this audience in India, the young millennial audience in India, actually wants pretty solid, fairly deep. They were interested in even long reads. We started off saying nothing will be more than 300 words, no video will be more than 40 seconds. And we were pleasantly surprised that if we did really deep investigative content or deep political analysis, this audience was engaging with us. So we actually evolved as the government in India became more and more absolute and oppressive, and we actually grew along. I mean, the powers that be kept defining us. Let me say it like that. One of the things that we realized when there was this huge movement in India about 2.5 years back when university students, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in India, there was a huge outcry among students there questioning the army atrocities in Kashmir. And they were speaking out, and they were then branded, they were charged with sedition laws, and they were actually taken to prison. And we found that the young voices in India were looking for a platform to say a lot of things that mainstream media was blocking out. And we just opened up the Quint. And we were inundated. We were bombarded with blogs, with angry voices. Of course, we would editorially vet it, but largely let the voice be. And there was a lot of disinformation around that and around who the students were. They were being branded as terrorists. And around that time, we realized that we have to address all the disinformation. You can't just say, like, this is false news, we will not engage with it. We realized that we have to pick it up and we have to debunk it and put the fact-checked content out. But yet again, we said now we have to, if we call ourselves fact-verifying, or we were looking for a catchy word. Now, bewakoof in Hindi means a moron. So we sort of turned it on its head and we made it webakoof, which is if you believe anything you come across on the web, you're a moron. And that sort of worked. It worked with our audiences. And we actually grew to be initially the platform. There was a whole slew of fact-checking niche sites that had come up, but none of them had the kind of reach that we had because we had grown in numbers very, very rapidly. Our traffic had grown very fast. Also because we were the only publishers in the company who were doing the volume of videos only for digital, and that sort of helped us grow very fast. And so we said we'll just be the platform for these fact-checking sites. But we realized that they were moving way too slowly and that they were too narrow in their focus. They were just sort of only taking on the Modi government. And we realized that there was so much other fake news that needed to be addressed as well. Yeah, there's just so much that our audiences needed to evolve with. So that's when we initially said that the entire newsroom by rotation will pick up and be trained in tools, both in video verification, fact-checking, and but we realized over time that we actually needed a team that focused only on this because the volume was so large. The next challenge for us on WebCoof was we realized that in India, WhatsApp is massive. It's possibly, I think there are over 1 billion users now on WhatsApp, and actually a lot of the fake news, the misinformation is actually spreading and being manufactured even by the IT cells, the official armies, well-funded armies. It's all being plowed into WhatsApp. Now, how do you get to that? Because that's happening in individual groups. It's growing very fast. Networks. It's not really making it to big news. It's not really making it to wires, or it's not making it to... So how do you get to that? So the intention there was... so we said, why don't we ask our readers to start sending us anything that they come across as suspicious? And the intention was really to be able to dive into this end-to-end encrypted universe and try and get, the nonsense that is floating around there. And we put out one call to action. I remember I was at the Banifra in Portugal at that time, and I was sort of trying to remotely orchestrate that. And we put out one call to action on Twitter, one post that went out. And within the next 3 days, we had about 250 mails that had come into us. And that was unnerving because we were not equipped to handle that. But it was also very heartening because that sort of flew in the face of this confirmation bias, and nobody's going to question it. Everyone likes to believe what reinforces their belief. But then we built this out. Now, this is a relationship we built out very strongly with our readers. On any given day now, we sort of calibrated a little bit because we don't have manpower large enough. We don't have 20 people working on just fact check. So we have about 15 to 20 pieces that come in from our readers asking for fact verification every day. But of course we do, that's only 1/3 of what we do because there's so much else that is happening. But interestingly, what started with the intention being let's find the moles in the WhatsApp universe, it's actually landed up building a very strong relationship of trust with our readers. So the unintended consequence has been actually fabulous for us at the Quint, because we're also sort of open to blogging by young people. We're also run a citizen journalism platform we call My Report. So this, it's made the ecosystem of this relationship with our readers and WebCoof has sort of become the brand that drives that much more than My Report.
So it's amazing. So this collaborative verification, collaborative fact-checking that happens with your audiences has actually developed, you think, a recipe for building trust, which you're now it's just been announced, right? You're actually doing a membership project in parallel. Right. The report foreshadows this, but you literally did it within the last 48 hours.
Yes, that's right.
So in all three cases, Daily Maverick, which has Maverick Insider, what are you calling the Quince one? I haven't even asked you that yet. What's your membership program? It's just
we decided not to give it a name because we're saying, listen, you've seen the special projects that we do, which is the deep dive journalism, where a reporter spends a month or more traveling and investigating a story. We have citizen journalism and we have WebCoof. So we're doing more than just news.
Yes.
So please help us and support us for our other initiatives. You don't have to pay us for our news.
Yes. So each of these organisations is now, you can see the trajectory, they've doubled down on public interest journalism in creative ways in response to a crisis in a manner that helps them to build audiences that are more loyal, that feeds trust, which hopefully works as a defence network. Is that a fair assessment, Maria, of what's happening also at Rappler?
So I think we are your canary in the coal mine also. You are, in many instances, we were in the same place before Duterte won and became president.
That's right.
And we had communities that were very vibrant, that would speak on social, that would have great discussions and actually, like in disasters, would actually act, come together, volunteer, and then. So what happened after Duterte won, though, is because, the opposition party will say it's partly our fault Duterte won because we gave him the platform. But what happened after that is our community was the first targeted. We were the first targeted because we were on social. And what happened is then they got scared. And I'd say about a year and a half, people were just, the first year from mid-2016, the first 6 months of the Duterte administration, they actually opted out of Facebook. So you can see Alexa ranking Facebook going from number 1 to number 8 in 6 months. By January 2017, Facebook was number 8. And then it slowly moved up. It's now back at number 4, but it hasn't gotten number 1. And then I think when we started pushing back, then we did the same thing. We get roughly 15 to 20 emails on fact-checking, but you can't, I'm sure the same with you. We couldn't keep up playing whack-a-mole all the time. And then what happens when the fact check is about you? My Indonesian parents, right? They're not Indonesian, but at some point then, I think we still have to find the next step. We haven't figured out yet. The community is getting stronger, but the community gets its strength from your ability to push back.
Yeah, for instance, in India right now, because the mainstream media in India has actually capitulated entirely. I mean, if you were to watch or read some of the legacy media, you would find that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the country. And I actually find that now that I've been around here at Perugia for the last 2 or 3 days, while I think largely people are aware of what's happening in Pakistan, I don't think people realize how close we are now in India to the lack of freedom of press in India. I mean, if on the index, if Pakistan is at the 139th position, we're at 138th. So we're not doing that much better, really. And there is this constant discrediting and constant undermining of those 3 or 4 media outlets like us, like The Wire, like Scroll. There's a Hindu, there's a Caravan. There's literally, you can actually literally count us on your fingertips in India, despite the fact that there is so many outlets just focusing on news, that it is so important to fight back every day. Because the day you keep quiet, it sort of just it underlines the fact that you might be wrong. And there is, and there's all kinds of hemming you in. An interesting conversation between 2 of India's largest media personalities that I overheard, one of them, of course, being my husband, and Pranoy Roy. It was amazing how they were actually competing with each other, saying, my raid was bigger, my raid was worse. How long were they in your house? 24 hours. How long were they, how much did they harass your employees? There's actually a little comparison happening, and that's really what it is. And which is why the importance to actually keep staying quiet but loud. That's actually what we're trying to achieve. Without being shrill, how do you keep putting your voice out there? Because every time you put your voice out there, there's 5,000 people discrediting you.
So the other thing that's interesting, and this moves to the West, is where is that line, our old lines, because we both came from broadcast, the line between journalism and activism.
Exactly, and advocacy.
Right?
Can I take that pivot? Thank you, Maria.
We're forced.
Exactly, and come to you now, Aron, as somebody who has both worked extensively in major Western news organizations and now observes innovation and broadly journalism from a more academic standpoint. What do you think are the takeaways from this report for Western news organizations and just your overall impressions of what we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as the absolute weakest link of this panel, I'm just thrilled to be sitting up here with these incredible people. I am honored beyond words. No, absolutely true. This is no bullshit.
Can we memify that and send it viral?
Yeah. I think the first thing, just right out of the gate, the amount of harassment, intimidation, and the environment you all are doing this incredible work in is just extraordinary. And it actually, we complain a lot about it in the US, but we're not seeing anything like what you all are. And doing incredible work and innovative work at the same time, which is extraordinary. And I also want to thank Julie and the Reuters Institute, which does not get enough love around the world for this work, documenting innovation and pointing to commonalities in organizations that are not, specifically that are not called the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the BBC, is super important because as Julie said at the beginning, there are things, many things that we can learn here and we should be learning here. And this is, as Maria said, in some ways, the canary in the coal mine across the board. I actually could write a study about all the things that I took away from the studies, but I will be really, really brief. But just to talk about, first of all, talk about innovation first. One thing we talk about all the time, and this harkens back to the panel that Julie was kind enough to be on earlier in this conference, where we always talk about things, AR, VR, blockchain, AI, machine learning, natural language processing, it goes on and on and on. That is actually not innovation. Those are tools that we can use toward an ultimate goal of achieving innovation, which is to say, an improvement in a process or a product. Here, I think you see so many examples of innovation that are around content, or around product, or around, in the case of Rappler, technologies that allow you to tell stories, to reveal the hidden connections behind these orchestrated campaigns that you otherwise would never see. They're just invisible to the naked eye. That is so impressive, so unbelievable. In the case of the Quint, to think about fact-checking as something that's kind of, for lack of a better word, fun and approachable. And you know, because a lot of times these things, you know, the way fact-checking is done, it's done with all the mirth of, you know, Wikipedia, you know, or an encyclopedia, and it feels almost like a chore. And so that is innovation, right? That's finding a way of creating a product. I know we hate, as journalists, to talk about what we do in these sorts of reductive terminology, but that's exactly what it is. It's designing a product that people want, solving a problem that people have, and addressing a job to be done, as Clay Christensen would probably put it. The idea that young people in particular, and this is, you know, when you're talking about young people wanting significant, deep, in-depth reporting, that I can tell you, the kids that I teach every single day at Temple, I can tell you 100% they do too. And we are at fault for, we look at them and say, oh, they're not reading newspapers, they're not watching the news. Yeah, they're not consuming the content in the way that we did. That doesn't mean they don't want it. We are the ones who are not serving them. And I think when you look at the growth of a site like the Quint, and how immediate the impact was and how people gravitated to it so quickly, I think it shows that there's such an opportunity here. There's such an opportunity to innovate and to address needs that are just not being addressed. On a more meta level, I think if you look at the study in aggregate, you could create quite an effective playbook for how to fight back. Maria, in your keynote, you talked about the playbook that the dictators use. Well, I think maybe we need a playbook of our own to fight back. And it would be things like finding ways to track these networks. I would love to see something like Shark Tank on a global scale. I would love to take the technology, the idea of being able to track these networks, track these coordinated campaigns, and combine that with one of the commonalities I'll touch on in a second, with this idea of reporting with your communities, communities of action, I love that term. Building communities of action, reporting with the people who feel invested in your work, and doing that on a global scale would be, I think, not only possible, but it might be necessary. And then finally, I'm not going to go on any longer, but I could. I have so many notes. Just finally, I want to talk about the community component because it actually is common. It's a big piece of all three of these sites. This idea that what we do as journalists, you know, we think of, you know, what is the job of a journalist? It is to report and toss it into the ether, and that's it. That's our job. We don't think about, you know, innovation. We don't think about particularly collaborative journalism, working with communities, having communities help us in this way, treating the people that feel invested in our work as, you know, essentially co-creators. And, you know, the way that this report documents the many different ways these organizations do that is incredibly important, it's instructive, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. In particular, organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Aron. That's yeah, it's a relief to hear, but it's, that there is so much potentially to take away from this, and I absolutely agree, and would encourage as many of you as possible when reading this report to do something innovative and collaborative. Let's try and do the build that Aron's talking about. Partly through time pressure, it's something that I would have liked to have done, but didn't have capacity to. But why don't we do that together and actually look at the ways in which we might interpret what's here and apply it in our own setting. And we have a hashtag for this project. It's #NewsInnovate. So feel free to hit me up against that hashtag, and maybe we can think about ways in the next phase of this project to do that. And from my perspective, coming from a Western news environment as well, I grew up in the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as a journalist. I was a political reporter, so this disinformation theme is very much a theme that resonates with me, and that in its analogue context was a problem, and the way in which it manifests now I've experienced in more recent times working at Fairfax Media in Australia, which is one of the biggest news outlets there. So for me, coming from an environment where we have spent an enormous amount of time genuinely, justifiably concerned with business models, with other existential crises connected to audience. This capacity to see what people are doing in spaces where the threats are not just real in terms of business models and audiences, the threats are real in terms of their capacity of their own countries to continue as democracies. And I realise there's resonance with US politics there as well, as some people have observed. But incredibly inspiring stories, I keep using that word, I'm overusing that word, that I think we can draw from in a way that hopefully helps us revisualize our mission. And I just want to go back to the point that Maria was getting to, which is this activism, this activist role. I mean, there's a lot, particularly in Western developed contexts, where there is not such a tradition of activism and advocacy, which is very much in contrast with the countries represented here, but also South Africa, which had its democracy born in part, in significant part, through collaboration with advocacy and activist journalism that was about the birth of democracy. So when I have these discussions often about needing to put this mission around disinformation and fighting back against, gendered online harassment and fighting for press freedom or media freedom, I often am told that this is disconnected from the stuff of journalism. It makes us uncomfortable because of objectivity and misinterpretations of that, perhaps. And also, it's got nothing to do with innovation. Maria.
I think this is the evolution of journalism. In our age today, when everyone can be a journalist, I mean, Jay Rosen, I mean, Clay Shirky, that, all the books that they've written about it, right? Everyone is a journalist. We the People, Dan wrote. And I think this idea that technically, so I was just talking to Rasmus about this on the way here, our government's actions force us to react in different ways. I refuse to not call a spade, and because I do, that makes us much more radical by CNN standards, say, right? Because I call a spade. I'm getting okay with that. And I'm far more straightforward than opposition politicians because I have nothing to protect. I'm not trying to curry the government favor. I'm not trying to win in elections. But I think that's one, evolution. Can I say just, yes, the second is my dream in this, and because I think we need to be present tense in this moment and eject all of the things we used to do. The dream for me, I'm going to look at Patricia, is for all the tech platforms to put up their data so it is transparent, that an Interpol for information warfare is created. I know that, I'm just putting up a dream. And then that allows, because imagine all of the data that is already out with the IRA, right? There's a lot of stuff out there, but no one is putting it together and saying, here is the global disinformation networks, and then each of us in our countries, a global Shark Tank, then each one of us in our countries can actually come bottom up so that we can clean up the ecosystem. And then finally, I'll just go to Rappler. Why? Why? Because, and I go back to the canary in the coal mine. The median age in the Philippines is 23 years old. We are young. And so we pivoted to the youth, just like the Quint did. But I am old. I tracked terrorist networks. So, this is, I think, a way we can do that. The second is, guys, the Philippines, we spend the most time online and on Facebook globally. I'll tweet the stat. And then finally, the last one, who manipulated, and this connects to the United States, Cambridge Analytica. When that scandal broke out, the country with the largest number of compromised accounts was the United States. The country with the second largest number of compromised accounts was the Philippines.
Yeah, incredible stories. I'm going to take a question or two, if I can, now, because we're rapidly running out of time. But one thing that, in my enthusiasm to launch this report, I've failed to do is to say out loud what's on your screens, that this report would not have gone to press as it did in such a timely manner without the hard work and many all-nighters of my co-authors, Felix Simon and Nabila Shabir, who are probably watching this back in the UK. So thank you to you, and specifically also to our publications officer, Alex Reed, who worked incredibly hard as well. I just think it's important to acknowledge that, and also my research team or the team that I'm part of at the Reuters Institute, which was absolutely pivotal to getting this out. So I've said that. I want to also say one other thing before I forget, that a sub-theme here, which you will read, is that these newsrooms are either gender balanced or they're female dominated. In the case of Rappler, they're led by 4 women, that they call them Menangs, which is a Tagalog word for older sister. And I think there's something there that I'm just going to leave that thought with you for the moment. You can delve into it, but it's worth considering the kind of the gender narrative here. It's not just about attacks on women, it's about women being empowered to fight back in incredibly instructive ways. So do we have a question in the audience or a comment? Or would you just like to hear more from these extraordinary women and possibly the fabulous man at the end? Yes, a question here. Do we have a microphone? There's one coming behind you.
Okay, hi. I'm Marcella from journalism.co.uk. There is something I want to ask you. I don't know whether you have an answer, but obviously journalists have been subject to abuse for decades, if not century, and yet no collaboration has really, we haven't seen really any collaboration in something like Shark Tank. And we have this idea, but it's not happening. Why?
Question, yeah, you, and Ritu, can you also, do you want to chime in?
Sure. But since it's...
Yeah.
I don't think this is a journalism thing. I think it's an internet and tech thing. You know, they haven't realized, they call it unintended consequences of the technology, but we have to think about this like it's post-World War II. When I talked about putting the database all together, I'm thinking we need like an Interpol to actually, because what we need to do is to stop the impunity. How do you do something like that? And the best minds of the tech company should come together to do this, because this is why the internet has been turned upside down. Countries like ours, we don't have enough talent. Well, India obviously does, but you know, go ahead.
Yeah, well, India has the talent, but the Indians who are working on tech for India are just doing the processing, unfortunately. They need to be doing bigger thinking. And to your point, I think one of the problems is for us, for any kind of collaboration, tech or otherwise, there's so much divisiveness and polarization within the media itself that it's very difficult to, I'll give you an example. In India, for instance, finally it seemed like digital media was coming together, but it seemed like they kept actually new digital media out, saying, listen, we'll turn to you in round 2. Right now, we're only legacy digital media coming together. So it's very difficult to have any conversations. In fact, I find it easier. I'll probably find it easier to have a conversation with Rappler and see how we can learn from Shark Tank than I can with anybody within the country.
But I think you have to move away from thinking that media can solve this problem on its own. We cannot. We are quite powerless. And these little things that we are doing, and they're little in the big scheme, that's why the internet, the tech platforms, the American companies with supposedly American values need to come in. And you know, I don't want to see that regulation do this for them. Mm-hmm. Maybe Aron, you can...
Yeah, I mean, this is the spectre, right? That we're in an environment where if we don't solve this collaboratively with the platforms, and I would add civil society and human rights organisations in the mix, because they're similarly invested in ensuring that open communication can continue to occur. If we don't, regulation is not just a threat, it's actually an action, isn't it? Yeah,
and it's impossible. I mean, really, I think you're talking about a global, you know, Mark Zuckerberg talks about regulating his company, but let's be honest, he doesn't really mean it. He doesn't. I think there's one other piece to this, I think, and that is a trusted third party, and we don't have that. We don't have, at least right now, we don't have an entity who can kind of be the connective tissue to bring together this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, there's not enough conversation happening between content, editorial, and tech.
Right, within a company, much less among companies.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although that's much more normalized within these organizations.
Yeah.
But I'll push one step further is that, you know, you talk about bringing everyone in. Guys, I'm tired. We talk all the time. There are people making these decisions right now who are not taking leadership. That's what what I'm really pushing is leadership there already. Sure, they have business concerns, but their business will die if they don't have enlightened self-interest.
Because what we're seeing now with the platforms being targeted for critique around this is much like news organizations a decade ago.
Being targeted.
Yeah.
But here's the magic of what I think, you know, you've heard today, is particularly the Shark Tank, to go back to that. You know, here you have the key, right? Initially, Facebook wasn't doing anything about, you'd come to them, you'd say, we have these, we've documented it, and they were saying, no, it doesn't violate our terms. Then you go back to them with data and show them, no, here's the pattern, and suddenly then it becomes a different situation.
Yeah. Over time.
That is incredible. We need to spread that.
Okay, we're out of time, sorry. It's been a long conversation. I'm going to end by saying there are 9 key lessons that I'd love for you to engage with that came from this. One is that a clear mission can help focus innovation. 2 is that mission-driven journalism is pivotal. It might divide audiences, but it's not the same as partisanship. And 3 is the ability to pivot in response to a crisis is an innovation marker or indicator. There are several more. I'm going to let you go into the report and find them for yourselves because our friend here has been very patient in letting me go over time. Thank you very much for coming. Please read and share.